What's going on, fellas? I wanted to start a series on the channel that I'm pretty excited about. I wanted to do another reoccurring series of videos where I interact with you guys, much like the question answering videos, but with a slightly different spin. I wanted to do a video series called Hot and Cold Takes, where you guys share with me your controversial strength training, conditioning, and nutrition opinions. You know, you run across something on Instagram that a lot of people seem to be agreeing with, and you disagree with it. Mark that in your mind. Go come drop it in the comments for my next one. I kind of want to get you guys thinking in the back of your head, like, hey, if I disagree with something, maybe that's something we could start a discourse on this channel. And I'm pretty excited about it. I think it's an interesting idea and another way to interact with you guys, because I think those are always much more entertaining than me just making something up, telling you guys my opinions, and that's that, right? So, as always, as we do with the question answering videos, if you guys have any controversial strength training opinions that you would like to hear my thoughts on, I break down why I agree, disagree, and some nuance, and why. You can either leave them in the comments of this video or put them in the community post that I will inevitably put up before I make the next one. So that's the introduction to the series. I hope you guys like this, because I think this is going to be a lot of fun. Got lots of good ones, very smart. I like that I have a community of people that like to think and talk about strength training as much as I do. I think that's a hell of a lot of fun. So we're going to get into these. I was super happy with these questions. I think they're good, and I think I can bring some nuance to these, and I actually disagree with a few of them. So I think that's pretty exciting. So the first one is Powerbuilding is a buzzword that really highlights that most people don't understand that hypertrophy is an important aspect of strength training. A power builder is really just someone who properly incorporates hypertrophy into their training and it isn't a separate training methodology. The reply to this that someone put, agree 100%. People who claim that they are power builders just want to pretend they are doing something new. I can't stand the stupid term. How do people forget everyone back in the day used to power build? For example, Franco Columbu was absurdly strong and an elite level competitor in bodybuilding. So here's my opinion. I agree and I disagree, right? Kind of a cop-out. First, power building is a buzzword. Absolutely agree. I think that a lot of the time it's people trying to sell the idea that they're doing something unique that tons and tons of other people aren't already doing. I agree with you. And I agree that a lot of the people who use the term also don't understand the fact that most high-level strength athletes are doing the same thing they are. A lot of the time, I think what will happen is someone will be genetically gifted in terms of hypertrophy, and they're doing the same training as this high-level strength athlete, but they end up looking disproportionately muscular and maybe a little bit worse as far as strength goes. And they're like, oh, it's because of my training that I look this much more muscular. I must be doing way more bodybuilding work than that guy is, when really that's kind of just their genetic strong suit. Getting at it all the way, I agree with all of this, but it has to be a thing. Matt Venna made a video on this that I thought was pretty solid. And basically, if we break down the idea that there is some optimal-ish training for bodybuilding, and there's some optimal-ish training for powerlifting, and they are not the same thing, as high-level powerlifters, high-level bodybuilders train very differently. There must be an intermediate. So you're absolutely right that a high-level strength athlete is going to be doing a reasonable amount of hypertrophy work within their training, but the amount of time they're spending in the 1 to 5 rep range is going to be significantly greater than a bodybuilder who's probably doing it never. Maybe you have someone who is powerbuilding where they spend a medium amount of time, where basically what they're doing is they're choosing to not be the best powerlifter they could be or not be the best bodybuilder they could be, and to pursue something in the middle, right? There's some amount of shoulder work that's going to be beneficial to increasing the bench press for a competitive powerlifter. But if your goals are purely aesthetics like a bodybuilder, that amount of shoulder work looks way, way, way more to the point where it's probably detracting from the bench specific training. So it has to be a thing. I think that when people talk about it, 9 times out of 10, they're misusing it or misunderstanding it or misunderstanding what other people are doing. But that being said, there is a thing where, like, okay, I read it, what I think is the best way to increase my 1RM in the squat, bench, and deadlift. And that includes maybe 3 sets of biceps a week, just because it is a stabilizing muscle. If I bump that to 20 and I bump my shoulders to 20 sets, I have to dial back my bench potentially. What I have created in my mind, in my opinion, would be a power building program where I am compromising some of that 1RM goals for a subset of goals, which is how I look. the end of the day, I do agree with you, and it does bug me when people say it most of the time, but there's a reason that we've gotten better since like Franco Columbu, since a lot of the guys who kind of pioneered this, Bill Kazmaier, Eddie Cohn, right? We have gotten better since then. And that's part of that is making the training more specifically directed towards the 1RM and doing a little bit less general hypertrophy training. Not none, but a little bit less. So I think that there's a good argument that those guys were doing power building. You're absolutely right. But less people are doing training as it was done back then now. And I do hate that people use it as a marketing term to try to differentiate themselves. Definitely agree with you there. The next opinion is I believe isolation work is really important for powerlifting and it's often neglected by a lot of lifters. Generally agree. I think one of the things that people will fall into is they'll see that a very high level lifter will do a minimal amount of isolation work and they think, okay, well that's how they got there. No, that's what they're doing now that they have an existing hypertrophy base. Earlier on in their training career, they probably did more bodybuilding style work. An easy example of this is, yeah, Andrei Milanichev didn't do any accessories really other than weighted crunches for the bulk of his competitive reign. But early in his career, before he was a powerlifter, he was a bodybuilder. He did lots of reps of various motions to build up muscle, and then came in with that existing hypertrophy base. So that's one misunderstanding that I think that leads to. And the other misunderstanding is sometimes you'll have someone who's extremely genetically gifted in terms of their hypertrophy. So just doing their strength lifting on a barbell, so the main lifts and their variations, is enough to see a significant hypertrophy response, and they don't need to do additional volume in isolation exercises to grow. But chances are you observing them aren't so genetically gifted. That you would need to do additional work to see appreciable hypertrophy in the primary movers. So that's another thing, right? So maybe it is, if you've got such insane hypertrophy genetics that you're going to grow at a reasonable rate, going to top out your weekly muscle protein synthesis just from the main lifts, then there isn't necessarily that great of a reason to do a ton of isolation. But 99% of us aren't in that category, and we're looking to the 1% that are oftentimes. The next question is squats have much more, squats have much more utility in a strength and conditioning program than deadlifts. I generally agree with that, not to go like full Robert Oberst, don't train the deadlift mode on you guys, but I do think that if you look at the benefit to fatigue ratio, it's not the greatest. Even if you do the deadlift sub-maximally, I don't see any reason to do a dead stop deadlift from the floor over an RDL for example, where we might get a little bit less fatigue, like axially, kind of any fatigue that kind of centers around our spine is going to be a little bit more detrimental to our total force output for athletic endeavors. Additionally, I think that it's very rare in a sporting setting where your lower back stability, bracing, and strength is going to be the rate limiter for your ability to output force in a competitive setting, whereas it's a lot more common for that to be your legs, your hips. I guess your core, your trunk, you could argue that, right? But generally speaking, I think that an RDL is something I would prescribe more often. I tend to agree with that opinion. The only reason I would give them deadlifts is if they want to do deadlifts, I guess, at that point. I agree. The next one is something that I've thought about over the years and don't know if there's an answer, but still fun to discuss. What is real strength and strength that is built by lifting weights overrated, or is strength that's built by lifting weights overrated? For example, my dad can't lift weights or anything close to that I can do, but he worked a labor job for a long time, whereas I never had a real intensive labor job. The guy has stupid strength and could probably break my hand in a handshake, and he's 60 years old. My working theory is that there's diminishing returns to strength training. Objectively, you can get strong by lifting heavier weights, but at a certain point, it's all just a certain point, it is just due to more skill and experience in those movements. I have no idea if any of this makes sense. I just think it's a fun, potentially outside the box topic. Well, this is a great point. I've experienced this myself. So what you're looking at isn't necessarily that you're not getting stronger past a certain point. It's just the specificity of that strength, right? We have to put so much into increasing a certain lift once we reach a certain level of advancement. So a perfect example of this is early in my training career, I was playing sports around when I started lifting weights. And that summer I was also working like a very physical landscaping job. I noticed every week that I got stronger in the gym, I performed better on the field, and my job was easier. I was stronger in these more general day-to-day tasks, right? And as I grew and grew and grew, the returns started to diminish off. It's just diminishing returns, right? So it's just like how a beginner lifter could do a bunch of squats and their deadlift will go up because they're not at a super high level in either lift. There's going to be a lot more transference between the lifts, right? As they reach higher levels of strength training, the degree of transference we're going to get goes down. And that's kind of the same thing where gym strength at first has massive carryover to real life strength, and it will gradually dwindle as we are specializing. We're not going backwards, but we are having to put so much into it that it's probably just taking away from potential training for other stuff. I think what you're looking at is almost a specificity in itself, right? If we view grip strength or that kind of manual labor type strength as a task in itself, probably your dad, when he started doing manual labor type work, his gym lifts increased from doing said manual labor. And then he got to the point where his gym lifts didn't go up. He was just getting better at general manual labor type strength. Same thing kind of goes both ways. I think that there's nothing unique about either quality. They're just their own discrete qualities. So it's like real strength doesn't exist in my opinion. I think that it's just all strengths are specific, and early on they're going to transfer over to other general strength qualities. But once you reach a higher level, you're going to see less transfer between them. So that would be my breakdown. Great question. Definitely, I don't have a controversial rebuttal to that. But yeah, no, that was a good one. And then the next question or next opinion is there isn't a specific form of training and programming that yields better results than another, i.e. conjugate versus linear. At the end of the day, you will progress as long as you apply significant effort every training session to yield adaptation, stay on top of nutrition, sleep, and other recovery variables, and identify your weak points. Strengthen them within your training methodology. Take all of this into account over a significant period of time and your lift will progress regardless of the training methodology. I think that is a big part of the cake. That's a big percentage of the equation. I agree with you, but I don't think that there's no difference between methodologies. I'm sure I could show you a really stupid one and you say, okay, yeah, if we took two clones, both clones are absolute studs, right? They're just like, they're sleeping all day, they're eating all their meals, they're hydrating like a motherfucker, they're just studs. And one of them is following a pretty stupid program of really low frequencies. They're gonna get technically more skilled at a slower rate, as someone maybe doing conjugate might, because their exposures to the competition motions are less, right? So specificity is real. That is my opinion. I think that's pretty validated by most evidence. And using that lens, we can say some programs are better than others. I think that you can get extremely good results in a wide variety of programs due to what you detailed, but I wouldn't say that they're all created equal. I do think that it's actually a lot of the forward progression we've seen in the sport is refining the training process. I think we've had a decent grasp of the outside the gym process for a while now. And a very simple example of this, right, would be comparing Stan Efferding's best competitive results, a guy who was very detail oriented about his outside the gym variables, very dialed in with his sleep, the nutrition, the active recovery, all of these things, he's nailing it. And his training program by modern standards probably wasn't the smartest thing in the world. It wasn't stupid, it was enough to get the job done, and he found that as long as he was nailing his outside the gym variables, he was able to progress. But is that progressing as fast as possible? Are there guys who maybe even are weaker in terms of just contractile property of their muscles who have put up better competitive results than Stan Efferding? I would contest yes. And the difference is not that they did even better with their outside the gym variables, not that their genetics are that much better, it's that they're more efficient at the motions because they train in a way that's conducive to mastering the skill of a 1RM and becoming technically efficient at it. So I guess I disagree with that one. The next opinion is the idea that if you don't use RPE in your training, you are not a serious lifter because all of the top lifters use RPE. Okay, I agree with this. I think there's lots of other ways to train, and there are high level lifters that use a little bit of a different approach, right? Some of them might even not be picking their top weight off of an RPE. They're just assigning an RPE to after the set, which is, I mean, it's generally helpful. I mean, why not at that point? But not everybody is working off of a strictly RPE based program. Tons of guys use percentages. Tons of guys use other forms of auto-regulation. So certainly agree with that opinion. And then the other half of this one is, on the flip side of that, using an RPE as a main progression isn't valuable because you can't accurately gauge how many reps they have in the tank. Strong disagree. If you're a beginner using purely RPE based programming, yeah, probably not the best idea. It's been shown in like real, peer-reviewed evidence that intermediate beginner lifters probably cannot accurately gauge their reps in reserve, and thus probably can't be accountable to work off of a strictly RPE based program. That being said, for advanced lifters, once you've developed that skill, because it's a skill like anything else, once you've developed the skill of assigning RPEs and predicting what weight will result in what RPE, for an advanced lifter, I definitely strongly disagree with the idea that it isn't valuable. I think it's a valuable skill to gain with time, and it can be a very valuable way of training for an advanced lifter who needs that little bit more auto-regulation in their program. They can't just have 80% for triples written and be expected to do that regardless of how much fatigue they've accumulated just by trying really hard. Once you get to a certain level of performance, that doesn't work anymore. We need some level of auto-regulation. RPE is just one way of including auto-regulation within your program. So that would be my opinion on that one. The next opinion is strictly standardizing rest times isn't needed for progressive overload. Honestly, I agree with that. On paper, right, we would like to keep everything the same for it to be pure progressive overload, but again, that's on paper. I think that when you say it's not needed, I think that phrasing I absolutely agree with. It's not necessary to achieve progressive overload to time to rest times. It could be a nicety, but a nicety is not needed. So I agree. The next one is squatting in the Smith machine is a one-way ticket to Snap City is the first half. Strong disagree. There's no evidence to support that. Doesn't make any sense to me. Part two is and has zero carryover to the other lifts. If you're a beginner, it's going to have carryover. If you're advanced, it's not going to have carryover. Once you get to a certain point of training, a motion for it to have any meaningful carryover is going to have to be very similar and a close variation of the squat. But for a beginner, just going up and down with your legs will carry over. But that being said, I do think it does, not to say it doesn't have a place. I think a Smith machine hack squat is a perfectly valid motion, especially if you don't have access to a hack squat for your bodybuilding work or your hypertrophy focused work for your legs. So it's not going to have like direct carryover as a strength motion. And I don't necessarily think it has a place as a strength motion, but it's not guaranteed Snap City. And I guess you're right in saying it has zero carryover, but I think that it could have a place within training. So that would be my take on it. The next one is agree or disagree. Diet is a tad overrated. What really matters at the end of the day is training and recovery. It's a good one, and I think this is very interesting. This question is very interesting to me because it seems to vary from person to person just observationally. I can tell you that for me personally, diet is not overrated at all. If my diet is locked in, I'm progressing. I could be undersleeping. I could be not even training that hard. If my diet is just pinpoint to the gram, I'm progressing well, and it's always been that way for me. But for even Max down the hall, right, that's not the case. Max needs to sleep. Max needs to train hard, and the diet can be like middling. Maybe it is a little bit overrated for him. So I'd say that just depends on the person, and identifying for you how important that variable is extremely important. The next opinion is overload training is stupid. Example being Ivan Makarov doing heavy block pulls to work on lockout when his starting position is seemingly the issue, or beginners doing bands and chains for more overload in one part of the movement. Okay, so generally speaking, I tend to agree with you. Anyone who knows me and has followed the channel knows I'm not a huge fan of overload work. I think that strength is usually best built in a sub-maximal manner. And I think that there's plenty, especially for beginners, it doesn't really have a huge place within training. I think that more often than not, when you're missing high in a lift, like you said, it's improving your positions early in the lift, improving your strength early in the lift, so that way you don't have to fudge your positions to get past the beginning of the lift and have to undo fudging the positions at the end. So doing a pause deadlift off the ground is probably more applicable to most beginners. So I tend to agree. I tend to favor away from overload work. I think it'd be sometimes helpful for overcoming, psychological barriers. But as far as physiologically driving strength adaptation, I don't see it as necessary. If you're using good technique, applying sufficient frequencies, intensities, and volumes, I really just don't think it's needed. But that being said, I wouldn't say it's always stupid. It can be done well by some high-level lifters. It's pretty common in strongman, even when they're prepping for a pull from the floor, to see pulls from an elevated height included. And lots of guys have built up a very strong deadlift using this methodology, with Big Z and JF Caron being prime examples of guys who will pull from an elevated height at a regular basis, even when they're prepping for a pull from the floor. So I would say in your sentence, yeah, it's stupid for the most part. For the average lifter, I don't think it's something that needs to be present or even should be present. So I guess I agree. And then the final one for the day, and this one has an addendum in the comments because someone asked a very good question. Love seeing really good training dialogue on the channel. Makes me very happy. So the idea that you need to do conventional movements to get strong, and the idea that specificity isn't always as important as it's made to be. Okay, so I'm guessing you're saying specificity isn't always as important as it's made to be. If I get very strong at a front-loaded pick and carry from the floor, and say a sandbag, and I do some heavy reverse lunges, am I not going to have a strong back and legs? Maybe it's not optimal for squat and deadlift 1RM performance, but I'd argue it's just as good for general strength. And someone in the comments brought up some good points, and they said, isn't that still specificity of some kind? As you said, it might not be optimal for conventional lifts, but specific to pick and carry heavy sandbags from the floor. Of course, strength is strength, but you can develop it in many ways. But each one is specific in itself. Great point, Croissant. I think I made that exact point earlier in this video. Agree with that wholeheartedly, right? And the guy said, that is true. Maybe I didn't get my point across very well. I mean that the general strength training with a variety of movements that can be interchangeable as long as it's similar in some aspect, i.e. a hip hinge is still a hip hinge and targets specific muscles, is as beneficial as using specific movements conventionally seen in the gym. Those movements are normally the same every week. I'm looking at this from the perspective of general strength, not strength-specific movements. I hope that clarifies my point. Thank you for your input, and it allowed me to word it better. Okay, so I understand what you're getting at. I think that this is less controversial in the latter wording of it. I think that you can achieve progressive overload and strengthen your body using a wide variety of motions, and they don't need to be the traditionally used motions for strength training. You can get the job done as long as progressive overload is achieved, and we're using sufficient range of motions at the relevant joints. We're using the same movement patterns. We can do general strength training quite well without using the most common motions. I agree with you, right? Each motion is specific to itself, as Croissant said, right? And as I talked about earlier, when we're less advanced, these things are going to carry over really well. Just doing sandbag picks, your deadlift will go up and up and up to a certain point, and then it will stop carrying over at any meaningful rate. Doing reverse lunges, your squat will go up and up and up, and then it'll stop carrying over so much at any meaningful rate. But you can develop strength with these motions for sure. I would attach the caveat, I'm a little bit of a purist when it comes to these things, so I'm getting my bias out there. I would say, in my opinion, right, this is my controversial take, I think, among some of the YouTube community, where they say, oh, you don't need to squat, bench, and deadlift. Those are just the power lift. They're not necessarily inherently better or worse than any other motion, which they aren't. I can agree with that on paper. But the conventional, traditional lifts that we look to for strengthening certain muscle groups, a lot of the time are the ones we look to for a reason. The squat, or the squat pattern of motion, is a very effective motion, right? The RDL is a very effective hip hinging motion for developing the posterior chain. The motions are very effective, so I wouldn't shy away from them if you have access. If the point is that you don't have a barbell, yeah, heavy sandbags, you can get a hell of a lot of training done. But I would look to get a barbell eventually, because on some level I do think you're missing out on a good stimulus. Maybe it's not any better for your goals, but it's also not any worse. And we could introduce a little bit of variety there. I would basically tell people you're right in saying that these motions aren't inherently that much better or more useful than other motions, but they're also not any worse. They're quite good. And I think that staying away from them is a mistake. If you don't like it, it's probably because you're not good at it. It might be worth getting good at it. And the other reason that people stay away from them that I don't like, that I see a lot on YouTube, is people will avoid the kind of more conventional lifts like the plague, because it can give them an illusion of strength to avoid something that has good comparison. Part of the reason that I'm considered good at overhead press is because there's a lot less people training overhead press than bench. And it's just an underdeveloped strength feat. And if a lot more people were training that as a priority, my overhead press would look a little bit more pedestrian. And I think that people are kind of taking advantage of that, where they force this image to intermediate beginner lifters on maybe YouTube that they are extremely strong, whether it be for a natural or for a not natural guy. But they're like, I'm not a power lifter, so I don't do these motions. I do these other motions. I never do those. There's perfectly valid reasons to do that. I'm not saying that everyone who doesn't train the power lifts is trying to hide their strength levels. That's not what I'm saying. But I can tell you that there are some guys that I've seen on YouTube that avoid the lifts like the plague because it would give them a level playing field of comparison to other lifters that are training the same thing as them and are similarly advanced, and it would make them seem less godly ahead of everybody else. It's something I definitely see a little bit on YouTube, not so much on Instagram, but avoiding fair comparisons in strength because you want to put forth an image. Definitely is one of my pet peeves. That being said, I'm not accusing anybody specifically, just something that I have noticed. Thank you guys for watching my video. Thank you guys for your participation. So please think of me if you're going through your Instagram and something annoys you, and a lot of people seem to be agreeing with it, and you're like, well, I don't agree with this. Please think of me and think about putting that opinion of yours into the comments of this video so I can do them in the next one and I get a lot of opinions, because I would love to do more of these. I thought this was very interesting, and I like having a discourse with you guys.